I'm David Hutchins with VOA's Middle East Monitor. Coming up, the Arab Spring enters its second year with a new Syria Arab League deal and renewed violence in Egypt. U.S. troops quietly leave Iraq, and U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman General Martin Dempsey marks the occasion.
I think it's important to point out we're really not leaving. We're establishing what I would describe as a normal relationship with Iraq.
And Israel releases more Palestinian prisoners. Will it improve or worsen relations? All ahead on The Voice of America. Syria has agreed to an Arab League plan allowing observers into the country to verify if the government will honor a deal to stop its security forces from attacking anti-government protesters. Syria's Deputy Foreign Minister Faisal Maqdad signed the deal Monday in the Egyptian capital, Cairo, following 9 months of violence that the United Nations estimates has killed at least 5,000 people. The Arab League suspended Syria's membership and imposed diplomatic and economic sanctions on Damascus last month to pressure it into accepting the peace initiative. Syria had demanded changes to the plan, saying the proposed observer mission would violate its sovereignty. Syria's closest ally, Iran, said today it backed President Bashar al-Assad's decision to implement the Arab League plan. Now, joining me in the studio is senior reporter Cecily Hillary. Welcome.
Thanks.
Cecily, do you think there's any chance this time the Syrian regime means what it says and will comply with calls to end the violence?
You know, that's the million-dollar question, Hutch. At this point, I'd say certainly most analysts are pretty skeptical. A little while ago, I spoke with Salman Sheikh. He's the director of the Brookings Doha Center. He's also a fellow at the Saban Center for Middle East Policy. And I asked him exactly what it was that the Syrians agreed to today.
Well, I think the details will come out over the next couple of days. In fact, I think what Syria agreed to will come out in terms of what Syria actually implements over the next few days. From what we're hearing, they have been able to put a 1-month time limit on this mission of some 100 observers who will be going to Syria, as well as guaranteeing free access. Well, we'll have to see whether that's actually the case. But before all of that, the Arab League is actually sending in the next 2 days legal, administrative, and some sort of a human rights experts to actually discuss the mission. So we're not actually there yet, in my view.
When they say observers, what kind of observers? Are they talking human rights activists? Are they talking media?
Well, I think we are talking about people from NGOs who are human rights experts, Arab officials, and even media representatives, yes. The one stipulation I think that the Syrians have insisted on is that they all be Arabs. In fact, the observers will be broken up into groups of 10. So in effect, we'll have 10 groups that will apparently be given free access to the various hotspots around Syria.
They still have to hammer out the details then. In the interim, Syria is free to continue its crackdown.
Well, and I would say that Syria will continue its crackdown regardless. I suspect that the death toll will continue to mount before any of these observers get in. And then there are very serious questions as to whether they really will be given free access and whether they will, in fact, be safe in touring the country. It's not out of the realms of possibility that the monitors may well come under some sort of an attack themselves. So it's certainly a mission which we'll have to monitor and to see if actually these monitors do get into the country and are able to do their job.
Well, there's certainly reason for skepticism because Bashar al-Assad has said he'd signed the protocol several times and backed away. Is there any chance he really means it this time? That perhaps the Arab League threat to go to the UN Security Council may have had some impact?
I don't believe it. First and foremost, if he was in good faith, implement the letter and spirit of this Arab League initiative, which, as you said, has been on the table for weeks now, he would effectively lose half his country. There are large parts of Syria, particularly the cities of Homs, Hama, Dara in the northeast, as well as in the northwest and the south, which would effectively be out of the regime's control. The protesters have shown themselves to be incredibly committed to ridding themselves of the regime and its security forces. No, this is a delaying tactic, in my view. It has come about as a result of the fear that perhaps the Russians and the Chinese may be wavering on their veto in the UN Security Council, as well as the threat made by the Arab League that they would refer this matter to the UN Security Council. So faced with this kinds of developments, Assad has had to relent and allow these monitors. But in my view, the history is that this regime talks a lot more when under pressure, but it doesn't implement.
Okay, Cecily, that was Salman Sheikh with the Brookings Doha Center. I have one more question for you before we go. Let's say the observers are allowed in for a month, but they're likely not to be able to roam freely. They might be taken around by Syrian authorities, but they'll come home, file their reports. The month is over. Then what?
Most analysts, sad to say, think it's unlikely that the violence will stop, that Bashar al-Assad is not going to stop this crackdown until he feels there is full consensus against him in the international community and also among his own people. We have seen a little softening of Russia's stance, but it's going to have to go a whole lot further before he really starts to feel the pressure.
And we're also seeing increasing numbers of military defectors and clashes between the military and defectors. Even, I think I read today, the possibility of defectors being executed in a firing squad. Yes. What are the chances of civil war here?
Basically, there are defectors. They're still small in number, and they're a whole lot smaller in number than the regime indicates. If we see a radical increase in the number of defections and attacks on the Syrian military, this would probably be all the pretext that Assad would need to use greater force, especially in Homs, and we know that the regime is capable of it.
Senior reporter Cecily Hillary, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
A spokesman for Egypt's ruling military told journalists today the use of force against protesters was justified, insisting that many were attacking or provoking soldiers or destroying government property. 14 people were killed and more than 300 wounded during the last 4 days of violence in Cairo's Tahrir Square. Edward Uranian reports for VOA from Cairo.
The latest actions against protesters in Cairo's Tahrir Square before dawn left many, mostly young protesters, angry and bitter. However, elsewhere in Cairo and across the country, the moves drew applause from some businessmen and ordinary citizens who say that recent protests were paralyzing the economy. Witnesses say military police swept through the square around 4 a.m. Monday, firing what sounded like percussion bombs. Other witnesses say police beat protesters who were staying overnight at a mosque bordering the square. Several tents were reportedly burned. General Adel Amara, a spokesman for Egypt's ruling Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, or SCAF, defended the actions. He accused protesters of provoking soldiers and destroying government property. He went a step further, claiming they were trying to destroy the state.
وهو ما حذر منه المجلس الأعلى دائما من إساءة استخدام الحرية.
He warns that the people are misusing their freedom to create chaos and trying to bring down the entire state rather than the regime of former President Hosni Mubarak, which has already fallen. The nation, he insists, is in danger, and the army, which has shown great patience, is under severe pressure. General Amara said soldiers are trained to be courageous, but complained that protesters were continually harassing them, hitting them with everything from knives to rocks, firebombs, and butagas canisters. Protests, he claimed, are no longer peaceful.
كيف ندعي سلمية التظاهر ونمنع دخول السيد رئيس مجلس الوزراء؟
How can the protests be peaceful, he asks, if the protesters are physically preventing the Prime Minister from entering his offices? Soldiers who are guarding those offices, as well as the parliament, continue to be taunted by protesters on a daily basis. The army recently installed cement blocks and barbed wire to prevent protesters from getting too close to parliament or the Prime Minister's headquarters. Al Arabiya TV showed protesters hurling stones at police guarding the building. At least 14 people have been killed and hundreds wounded in the latest violence, which began Friday when military police broke up a sit-in in front of both Parliament and the Prime Minister's office and chased protesters from Tahrir Square. An historic library was gutted during the violence. The army crackdown brought condemnation from many foreign capitals amid video of police beating protesters and at least several using weapons against them. Prime Minister Kamal al-Ganzouri, however, denied that security forces fired live ammunition at protesters. Edward Uranian for VOA News, Cairo.
Now, this past Saturday marked the first anniversary of the Arab Spring. This historic mobilization of protesters across the Arab world began with the self-immolation of Mohamed Bouazizi, whose act of protest triggered a revolution in the North African country. From Paris, Lisa Bryant reports for VOA that while Tunisia appears to be heading towards a largely positive future, the outlook for other countries in the region is more murky.
It was a singular act of defiance by an impoverished 26-year-old vegetable vendor living in Tunisia's economically depressed heartland. Mohamed Bouazizi's self-immolation on December 17, 2010, to express his despair and anger at local authorities, triggered a national uprising that brought down dictator Zine El Abidine Ben Ali a month later. Today, Tunisia is fundamentally and most believe irreversibly changed. In October, widely praised elections ushered in a new coalition government, with the moderate Islamist El Nahda party the dominant power. Retired U.S. diplomat William Jordan, a North Africa expert, gives Tunisia a largely upbeat assessment.
I think that overall, the trend is positive. I mean, Tunisia's institutions, new institutions, are proving to be much more durable and responsive to the Tunisian people's desire for a more democratic, more open political system and a decisive break with the Ben Ali regime.
Human Rights Watch's Deputy Regional Director, Eric Goldstein, also praises Tunisia's evolution over the past year.
People are free to go out in the street and protest. New newspapers have been created. There's an atmosphere there that is completely different from the state of fear that Ben Ali enforced.
While Tunisia's revolution was largely peaceful, it has not been painless. The country's key tourism industry and foreign investment plummeted. The uprising in neighboring Libya sent thousands of refugees across the border and drove Tunisians working there back home. Tunisian immigrants piled up on Europe's shores, desperate for jobs. Rebooting the economy is one of the biggest challenges facing the new government. Azza Turki is a political journalist for the Tunis-based weekly Realite.
Really now what changes between last year and this year is that the Tunisian citizen is impatient today. He doesn't accept anymore to wait to have a job. He considers that he made a revolution to have a better situation, economic situation, social situation, and he just cannot wait anymore.
The country also faces political problems. The new coalition government is already squabbling. Critics fear the growing power of El Nahda and a rollback of women's considerable rights. Earlier this month, thousands of hardline Islamists and secular activists staged opposing demonstrations in the capital Tunis, underscoring a growing standoff about the role of political Islam in once secular Tunisia. The Islamists have occupied university campuses, demanding gender segregation and other restrictions. Acts El Nahda has condemned. Human Rights Watch's Eric Goldstein.
What women are concerned about now, among other things, is this new climate of intolerance that we see in evidence in these protests on campus or other places where women gather to demonstrate in support of their rights, and they're surrounded by men who are insulting them, menacing them, and in some cases physically attacking them.
Journalist Turki is worried about Tunisia's future.
The situation isn't clear. I mean, we don't know how to go, where to go. This government, I don't know what is his plan.
So far, Jordan and other analysts say, Tunisia remains the only Arab Spring success story. Whether Mohamed Bouazizi's desperate act will lead to others remains to be seen. Lisa Bryant for VOA News, Paris.
On Saturday, U.S. Defense Secretary Leon Panetta pledged U.S. support to Libya during a visit to the capital, Tripoli. The Pentagon chief offered the help to the country's transitional leaders who are struggling to create a cohesive democratic society. He met with Prime Minister Abdurrahim al-Kaib and the country's defense minister Osama al-Jawali. The talks came a day after the U.S. lifted most economic sanctions against Libya in an effort to ease a financial crisis in the country. After the meeting, Panetta told reporters that Libya would determine what assistance it needed from the international community.
I believe that this new and free Libya can become an important security partner for the United States. Libya is now in the hands of the Libyan people. They will chart their future. They will determine what assistance they require from the United States and the international community.
On Friday, the U.S. released more than $30 billion in Libyan government assets. The UN Security Council took a similar action in freezing an estimated $150 billion of Libyan assets. The world body froze the funds after the rebellion against former leader Muammar Gaddafi when it broke out in February. British Foreign Secretary William Hague said his nation will pressure the EU to swiftly release $10 billion in Libyan assets that are frozen in Britain. Panetta is the first American defense secretary ever to visit the country. His visit to Libya took place at the end of an overseas tour that included Afghanistan, Iraq, Turkey, and Djibouti. Also over the weekend, on Sunday, the last convoy of U.S. soldiers left Iraq, ending an almost 9-year U.S.-led war that ousted Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein and left a fragile democracy still facing insurgents and sectarian divisions. The final convoy of 100 U.S. military vehicles carrying about 500 troops crossed into Kuwait on Sunday morning, about 7:38 local time in the morning, leaving behind several hundred U.S. security personnel at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. The withdrawal ended a war that cost the lives of almost 4,500 U.S. troops, tens of thousands of Iraqis, and hundreds of billions of dollars of U.S. government funds. The last U.S. military convoy departed from a base in the southern Iraqi town of Nasiriyah under cover of darkness and secrecy to prevent any final attacks as it drove across the desert highway toward the border. The American soldiers cheered as they entered Kuwait and said they look forward to reuniting with their family. U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman General Martin Dempsey said the U.S. military will continue its relationship with Iraq through a security cooperation office that will focus on continuing to develop Iraqi security forces. Dempsey spoke with the Al-Hur television network during a visit to Riyadh and urged Iraqi leaders to beware of Iran's intentions.
I think it's important to point out we're really not leaving. We're establishing what I would describe as a normal relationship with Iraq, such as that which we have around the region, to include here in Saudi Arabia. So it'll be based on an Office of Security Cooperation. Significant number, a couple of hundred U.S. soldiers, contractors, and what we'll be basing our relationship on is continuing to develop their security forces.
Do you think the United States will continue to have an influence in Iraq?
I do. I'm a little reluctant to use the word influence because it sounds manipulative. I mean, what I would say to you is that based on a security framework agreement that we've been working on for the last 3 years, this is not, something that's new. We haven't spoken about it much, but we have a security framework agreement that causes us to have a relationship with Iraq economically, culturally, commerce, trade, and military. And I think it's the sum total of those that will allow us to maintain our relationship and to help Iraq continue to develop.
What are the main challenges that make you concerned about the future of Iraq?
Well, as you know better than I probably, but as I've learned over my past 10 years with Iraq, there are still some lingering historical differences among them. They have ethnic tensions and religious tensions. They have a very, very immature democracy. In the United States, we declared independence in 1776. We wrote our Constitution in 1787, 11 years later. So we're just 8 years into this new form of government in Iraq, and I think they've got to work through some things, and I hope we're there to help them do it.
Do you think Iran still have an influence in Iraq, and what's the size of Iran's influence?
I'm sure Iran has an influence. I'm certain Iran has an influence in Iraq, and I'm sure they have an interest. Now, some of that interest is to be expected. They're neighbors. And so economic interests and even some political interests are certainly to be expected. But I think there's also a nefarious side of Iranian influence, trying to draw Iraq too closely into their particular beliefs about the world order and about security. And so I think Iraq's got a balance. And I think by the way, I think Iraq is aware of this. Iraq has to balance the positive influence economically, for example, that Iran may be able to bring against some of the more nefarious influences that Iran is trying to use against them.
The quiet withdrawal was a sharp contrast from the start of the war in March 2003, when U.S.-led forces launched airstrikes over Baghdad as part of what they called a shock and awe campaign against Saddam. U.S. and allied ground forces then stormed from Kuwait into Iraq, toppling the minority Sunni dictator of a Shiite majority nation within weeks, and captured him by the end of the year. Israel has completed a prisoner swap with the Palestinian militant group Hamas that rules the Gaza Strip. Robert Berger reports from the VOA Bureau in Jerusalem.
There were celebrations in the West Bank as Israel released 550 Palestinian prisoners. This Palestinian celebrant said it is a step in the right direction.
We believe that we have our state and they have their state, and we can live together with peace.
It was the second phase of a prisoner swap that won the release of captive Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit 2 months ago after 5 years of Hamas captivity in the Gaza Strip. Israel freed 477 Palestinian prisoners in the first phase. The final tally, 1,027 prisoners for one Israeli soldier. While the Palestinians celebrated, there were mixed feelings in Israel. The first phase of the swap saw the release of top Hamas militants involved in deadly bombing and shooting attacks. Israeli analyst Dan Shiftan expects a new wave of terror.
This is the greatest significant victory for terrorism that Israel has made possible since its establishment, and it will cost us many people dead and captured.
Nevertheless, polls show that the vast majority of Israelis support the prisoner swap and the national effort to bring their soldiers home at any price. Robert Berger for VOA News, Jerusalem.
NATO says it will continue to conduct nighttime raids in Afghanistan despite renewed objections from the country's president. NATO spokesman Brigadier General Karsten Jacobsen said today the night raids remain the safest way to take out insurgent leaders. He said the raids account for less than 1% of civilian casualties and no shots are fired in 85% of operations. Afghan President Hamid Karzai again condemned the nighttime operations on Sunday after a raid that took place on Saturday on the home of a senior counter-narcotics official and not the targeted leader of the Haqqani militant network. The raid left a female relative dead and 4 others wounded. Karzai has called for foreign troops to stop entering Afghan houses, saying residents cannot feel secure if they think armed soldiers might burst into their homes. Jacobsen said Afghan special forces are increasingly taking the lead in the night raids. This has been VOA's Middle East Monitor. Join us Monday through Friday for news from the region, interest to the region. Coming up on International Edition, the dear leader is dead. What does the future hold for North Korea? Thanks for tuning in.
Are you following the uprisings in Syria, Egypt, and other Arab Spring countries? Want to contribute? Voice of America has launched a new social journalism website for the Arab Spring called Middle East Voices. Incubated by our thousands of fans on Facebook and Twitter and dedicated journalists at VOA, this site takes a new approach to covering the region through investigative journalism, publishing your viewpoints and harnessing social media to tell stories in a new, innovative way. Become a contributor at MiddleEastVoices.com.